UDL in Action podcast wishes to acknowledge First Nations peoples in Australia and across the world whose songlines traverse the globe. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging whose cultural traditions inspire and continue to educate.
How can I design learning experiences that support multiple and less traditional modes of expression while staying aligned with curriculum goals, scaffolding student independence, and addressing biases around how learning is communicated?
Welcome to today's episode of UDL in Action. In this episode, we're exploring Guideline 5. At the heart of this guideline is a simple but powerful idea. There is no single best way for students to demonstrate what they know. While some learners thrive through writing and speaking, others may communicate their understanding more effectively through visual design, audio, performance, multimedia, movement, or digital creation. And these are just some. UDL encourages educators to create learning environments where diverse forms of expression are not only accepted, but valued. I'm your host, Rebecca Rosenberg, and joining me as always is our magnanimous co-host, Rhonda Laswell from Indiana. Rhonda is a retired educator and Universal Design for Learning coordinator. She spent nearly 2 decades immersed in UDL as both a teacher and a professional development coach for educators. It's always inspiring to listen to your understanding and know-how, Rhonda, of putting UDL into action. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's always great to be here.
Traditionally, schools have relied heavily on written assignments, essays, and tests, Rhonda, as the primary ways students demonstrate learning. It's probably what you experienced. It was certainly what I experienced.
Yes.
While these methods can be effective, they don't always provide an accurate picture of every learner's understanding. Joining us also is Zach, who is an early career teacher in Queensland. Let's have another listen to his question on Guideline 5.
How can I design learning experiences that support multiple and less traditional modes of expression while staying aligned with curriculum goals, scaffolding student independence, and addressing biases around how learning is communicated?
So what Zach is really asking, Rhonda, is what if students could show their learning in different ways while still meeting the same curriculum outcomes? I know that by broadening opportunities for expression, we reduce barriers and create more equitable pathways for students to demonstrate their learning. What are your thoughts and ideas on Guideline 5?
Well, initially, when I think about his question, my mind goes straight to the curriculum guidelines or the standards, right? And so I think it's really, really important when you're designing learning experiences that you make sure that you are taking those standards or those curriculum guidelines and you're actually looking at them to see if they have somehow enmeshed the goal or the means and what the skill is or what the content is. And so what I mean by that is, I'll give you just a really basic example. You're giving a spelling test, but you're also going to, at the same time, look at handwriting. So are you looking at handwriting or are you looking at spelling? And when you can flick the two together for a student, that can be a little overwhelming because their penmanship would be much better if they were writing something they were interested in personally, like maybe their favorite character. And so you would look at their handwriting for that where there's high interest, right? Because you're looking at a skill. But then when you're actually looking at content, which is knowing the spelling words, you may let them type it, you may let them write it, you may let them have mixed up letters that they have to put in order. There may be a lot of different ways that you might want to consider doing that. So the first thing I would say is make sure that you're not embedding the means and the goal. And to Zach's question too, with students who are older, I don't think there's anything wrong with giving them the standard and having them put it into their own words, because that's what they're learning, right? And teaching shouldn't be this kind of Wizard of Oz behind the curtain kind of thing where, boof, you're doing these activities. And by the way, this is why, because, this is a standard. So I think that having that up front for them is really, really important. But when we talk about biases, we have to make sure that we're not just looking at something that may be dictated because of a disability, for example. Biases show up in a lot of different ways. And so it can be something cultural, right? Or it could be something that's preference based. So giving students lots of opportunities to interact with skill and content as part of the learning process and not just part of the assessment. So it seems to me that teachers struggle most with executive functioning when it comes to action and expression. And I think there are a couple reasons why that's the case. Executive functioning is a set of skills that have to be taught, and when they have to be scaffolded and they have to be supported. And we know our brains are not fully developed until our mid-20s. And then we wonder why students forget things, right? Or have a hard time making connections. It's because their brains are not fully developed. So I think it's really important when we talk about action and expression, not only are we building in opportunities for students to have multiple means of interacting with the content, whether that be multimedia, an object lesson, something hands-on that they can get in there and hold and do something with. But it's also important that we're embedding opportunities for them to build their executive functioning skills. And we don't realize how much doing school actually taxes the brain.
And so,
Just getting from point A to point B, right?
the more that we as teachers are making clear the intention behind that assessment task, so like the example that you just gave in regards to this, initially thinking I'm going to test spelling, but I'm also going to test handwriting. But instead of thinking I'm going to tick 2 boxes so that task is done, be kind, be specific, and be intentional. In this particular activity, I'm just going to test spelling. But another time when I'm looking at handwriting, let's make it as interesting as we possibly can. Rhonda, that segues us into really thinking about consideration 5.1, using multiple media for communication. So what stands out to you in practice in regards to this question? So you said using technology, and I also really appreciated your example when spelling, because that's come up for me in my practices as to how we can test our students or assess our students on their spelling knowledge in different ways as opposed to just spell normal and then saying a sentence with the word normal in and then saying the word again. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly, spelling is one of those that comes up over and over again. And partly because, we have individuals say, well, our phones fix it for us. And when we're typing, we have spell checker. But there's a lot going on in the brain when we're putting words together and we're doing phonemic awareness. There's just a lot behind the scenes. We also know that how the brain develops typing is very different from handwriting. There is something going on in the brain with handwriting. And handwriting in and of itself is therapeutic, right? It's repetitive. It feels good, and so there's a calming effect that actually has on the brain. So that aside, there's a lot going on there. But when we're thinking about multiple means of communicating, it's not just about thinking about that kiddo that may have a communication device. It also goes to, again, that ability to contribute in the learning community in different ways. Certainly having a back channel, right? Having a blog that's just running in the background that students can add things to in conversation if they're a little uncomfortable raising their hand or saying something in front of the class. But we also don't want to forget here that we can communicate in other ways. And so, for example, what I would have my students do sometimes when we were working with things like diffusion or homeostasis, because I was science, I would have them actually get up physically in the room and have certain students be the cell wall, and then certain students be, salt or a dye, right? And I want you to show me diffusion of red dye. You five are red dye and you're in cold water, and you are blue dye and you're in hot water. What's going to happen, right? And to watch them move very slowly, right? And slowly separate themselves, and then to move much more quickly. You have to understand, not only are they showing me what they know, but students who may have not gotten it now have another visual for understanding that concept. And so they're going to be much more likely to remember it because now they have another rendition of it. So it really is just thinking out of the box and being creative with all the different ways that you can allow students to demonstrate, but also just interact in a learning community where they're contributing to each other.
Rhonda, you have just summarized consideration 5.2, whether you knew it or not. I'm not sure if it was intentional, but you have literally explored how educators can effectively use different tools to support construction, composition, and creativity. So, in that particular example, you would be assessing students' knowledge by how they move or by perhaps then how they then explain to you what has just taken place. How
Mhm.
did you then determine what each individual student knew about that particular science concept as compared to other students?
So, in a situation like that, it's just another opportunity for them to act and interact. And I wouldn't necessarily, unless I put them in smaller groups. And so, the best way to handle that, if I really wanted that to also work for me as an assessment,
Yeah.
then I would have people in smaller groups and I would go around the room, and then I would have that conversation more in tune with maybe 6 or 8 in a smaller group versus right a larger group where it'd be easy to hide behind the scenes. And that's what's so great about having them actually do activities. It frees you up then to interact with either students one-on-one or in small groups. And I think that's really important too. So what I would often do is I had 3 cups. I kept my students in groups, but then I would have 3 cups and I would have green, red, and blue. And if they were doing a group activity and everything was humming along, they kept green on top. If they were stuck and couldn't go forward at all, they put red on top. And if they had a question, but it wasn't hanging them up from proceeding, they would put blue. And so being able to make your life easier in the room too is really, really important. And that's another form of communication, right? It's a visual form. Anybody in the group can pop that cup up if there's a question or a concern. So just breaking them down into smaller groups would be the easiest way to kind of dig in a little bit to make sure that I knew everyone knew what was going on.
And then in those smaller groups, do you individually go around and talk to students, or do you then individually ask them to write a reflection? I guess it'd depend on the standard. It'd depend on the
Yeah.
goal of what we're wanting students to be able to express what they know. But if they did an activity such as that, where they used their bodies to represent what they had been learning, and then went back and decided or had choice around how they then summatively showed, well, it
Yes.
summatively showed you their knowledge. They could do that through technology. They could do that via writing, is what we were talking about before. They could
Drawing a
do it.
diagram. Yeah,
Infogram.
I would have students
Wonderful.
draw, yeah, I would have students draw circles close together and far apart and label them blue dye or red dye. Yeah, or I would just say, hey, when I come by, if you don't have that recorded in some sort of way for me to look at, just tell me. Just tell me. And I will tell you 9 times out of 10, I'd have maybe 2 kids in an entire class that would want to just tell me. Most of them get busy, right? They write it in sentences, they draw a diagram, they type it. Most kids just kind of go to what they go to. But I'd maybe have 1 or 2 in a class period that would want to just tell me. And what's wrong with that?
Absolutely. And it's allowing them to be creative in the learning
Yes,
process, even though it's an assessment task, which traditionally can be quite overwhelming. But this
it's
opportunity
also
is fun.
yes, and it shares power. You know, so often kids feel like they have no locus of control, and that locks them down too and hijacks them often. And when you give that control back over to them to decide what works best for them, their brain relaxes, their cortex opens up, and they're open for business.
Isn't that interesting? It's that is then a segue into consideration 5.32, where building fluency with graduated support literally looks like what you have described in the classroom context, doesn't it?
Yeah, and scaffolding is something that just really is, if you look at a lesson from start to finish, right? There are all these steps along the way. And along those steps, there are going to be certain kiddos who may need extra support. So by looking at what that is, and can you hear her?
You're fine. It's no problem at all.
I'm so sorry.
Not at all. Not at all. Just a little bit. It's no problem.
So, just a little note here, listeners. I am dog sitting my daughter's dog, and she, for some reason, decided to bark all of a sudden. See, and that's the way it is in the classroom. You just never know what's going to happen. And so you have to be able on the fly to adapt and be flexible, right? So, um, anyway, I think,
That's honestly, that is a perfect example because we're talking about it doesn't mean leaving students to figure everything out on their own. It's
right,
quite the opposite. Students need explicit support before they can
yes.
confidently use new communication methods too, and before they're able to uh, do those tasks in a confident way in a manner where their executive functioning has been supported to be able to genuinely just enjoy the task that they've been asked to do in
And
an
sometimes
authentic way.
know what's coming,
Yeah,
right? So it's not like this, I'm on water and I don't know how to balance myself. Letting them know what's coming and what the expectation is and what they're going to be doing, and that there is going to be support for that. That if I know you struggle, some of you in here find the vocabulary to be very challenging, right? So we're going to be putting a word wall up, and you can definitely create your own little personal dictionary if you need to. Just speaking that out loud is really helpful to those students because they know that you have their back, and that's really important.
it's so important, Rhonda. I was teaching a class where I wanted the students, it was a HAS class, it was a primary class, and I wanted the students to be able to express to me what they knew uh, about a certain location in Australia. So that it was a persuasive task. So what I
Mhm.
did to show them an example was I actually made a brochure to a location that we had been to as a family. But I didn't necessarily want all students to do the brochure. I just gave
Right.
them an example of what they could consider if they wanted. I had one student do a PowerPoint presentation. I had another
Uh-huh.
student do an improvisation or an oral presentation, and she got all dressed up. It was quite wonderful. And the other student did this very creative poster about the location that that we had been talking and learning about within Australia. So providing that example just was a segue for them to know what I was requiring. We had also discussed the criteria and specific aspects they knew needed to be incorporated within their assessment their assessment that they were providing me or giving me at the end of the day. Yeah, that's
So you just
wonderful.
spoke to why it's so important to have a rubric.
Mhm.
Because a rubric really it's a roadmap for students. And tell them that this rubric is a roadmap to where we're going. And it's going to show you all the steps along the way and what you need to do. There should be no I gotcha at the end. They should know exactly what's expected, what the criteria is, so that they can formulate for themselves how they want to do their plan of attack. And with a rubric, you've got every single component in there. And by having every component in there, then they have more freedom to decide how they want to express it. And so just giving choice is not enough. You have to give an exemplar, you have to give some structure, and then the rubric also is really it's their guide to that.
I couldn't agree more. And it's again, we've talked about previously, it's like having the goal when we, or a targeted location when we put in when we're wanting the directions in our GPS. How we choose to get there via the options that are given to us is up to us, but where we want to go is clear because we've tapped that information into the GPS. So finally, Rhonda, with consideration 5.4, and you've referred to this previously, just slightly. So if we want to, if we you don't mind going back over that just a little bit further, how can educators address biases around different modes of expression and communication? Does it begin with not just recognizing, but truly valuing diverse ways of communicating?
Yes, because culturally speaking,
Yes.
we have students from many different backgrounds. I know when I taught in public school, we had students speaking 52 different languages. And that's not just, we can't think of it as just a different language. There are social norms and constructs within those groups of individuals. I'll give you a perfect example. We had a group of students go watch a play at a theater in the capital of the state. And so as they were watching this, the social norm for certain students is obviously to sit and be very quiet and not even whisper, right, or speak. But we had a particular cultural group of students, and they have a very rich oral, right, tradition. And they have a different way of communicating in that situation. And for them to speak out and to respond to the individuals that are in the play is very normal for their social group. For us to reprimand those students would not be appropriate, right? Now, if we want to talk about what norms are before we go, we can do that. But then at the same time, we also want to be respectful of the fact that to them, that shows that they're engaged, that they're paying attention, not that they're not paying attention or that they're heckling. So, you have to know and understand those things. And then also, too, when we think about biases in communication, just expecting a student to be able to express something in a specific way at a certain point in time, at a certain age, right, or a certain grade, is really placing a burden on them and kind of a yoke, right? And a really easy example I always like to give is that, we may have a student on the spectrum who could tell you more than you want to know about a topic that they are really interested in, right? They could teach you a master's level class probably on it. But for them to sit down and write you a 5-paragraph essay, it's going to look like they don't know anything about that topic, and they actually do. So, giving students choice when you're asking for content and how they're going to give you that information back is really, really important. Now, they could tell you about it, right, all day long. So if they had a bulleted, it could be a set of bullet points or rubric, because scaffolding for rubric might be bulleted points for some students. And yes, that's okay if they have a different rubric. But they could simply just record themselves talking about it and staying inside the confines of those bulleted points. Whereas you may have another student who could just write all day long about it, and you may have to even limit the number of pages they can have in that 5-paragraph essay. But again, back to your point, right? Allowing them to communicate what they know based on what is best for them and where they're at in their development. So I always find it interesting that we somehow think that biases only have to do with culture or disability, right? And there's so much more to it. We have biases against the developmental level of our students' brains often. And I think it's
That's
really
challenging.
important to
Yeah.
think about that, right? And to make sure that you are honoring their stage and level of development, and where they're at with their executive functioning, because that's our
And
job.
traditional exam or assessment styles have unconsciously, I know it's not necessarily been intentional, but has unconsciously biased those students who learn or communicate in a certain way compared to other students, such as the example you've given regarding a student with autism. Like, how restrictive and frustrating would that be for that student who knows so much in their mind, in their brain, but then
Yeah.
when required to write a 3-paragraph essay, is completely dumbfounded. It's
Well,
just
it's disabling by the context.
very
And we always say
disabling.
disability is contextual, right?
Mm,
So, what's disabling for you in a
yeah.
certain context may be different for me
Yes.
in another context. And it also may be the content itself. So for some students, one area of content is their jam, and for another one, it's very disabling.
And we need to be aware of that as our teachers. That's why the standard for us, the achievement standard, is such an important or pertinent goal by which we need to by which we need to target and have it clear in our own minds as to what we're wanting to achieve or what we're wanting to teach our students, and not be bogged down by all these other traditional approaches that can be just so disabling, as you've just expressed. Creating
And those
inclusive.
can
No, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, and those can be broken into digestible pieces as well. Like we don't have to try to bite the whole thing off, right? And that when you break it into pieces and parts, it makes it much more easy for you to look at the guidelines and the checkpoints and to really make sure that you're honoring those as you put it into chunks, right? As you break it down and make it more digestible, that automatically leads you then to your goal, but it also leads you to the different pieces and parts that make up a week's long, group learning activities, or a unit itself, is dictated by how you break up those standards.
And I love the way you briefly referred to checkpoints that are now referred to as the considerations. But I love the way Cass shifted that wording because of what you're talking about is the importance of breaking it down, but considering whether or not this particular aspect of the guideline is appropriate for the task that is taking place or the assessment that is taking
Mhm.
place. It's not about ticking boxes, which is what we as
Right.
teachers can be inclined to do. I certainly am, I have to confess. It's really about being clear about the intention, the purpose behind what you're teaching, but in this case, and in what we're talking about, in regards to that assessment task, this has been
Absolutely.
great conversation, Rhonda. Creating inclusive learning environments means recognizing that diverse communication methods can demonstrate rigorous thinking and deep understanding. I'm immediately thinking it's the difference between equality and equity. UDL Guideline 5 reminds us that expression and communication are deeply personal and highly varied. Rhonda, what is your takeaway message for listeners today in response to that?
Well, I think when we're deeply enmeshed in the action and expression, what really comes to my mind is scaffolding for executive functioning skills. But at the same time, making sure that you're sharing power, right? That you're giving some of that power to your students so that they can feel like they are active participants in the learning environment, but that you've still got those pieces that help support that along the way. And it helps them be organized, right? It helps them feel safe. It helps them to relax and to open their brains up in a space that is enjoyable, challenging, but they're also willing to take risks.
And it continues to develop that learner agency, which is
Yes,
it's one of our ultimate goals as teachers. That's great.
absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. And remember, giving students meaningful choices such as what Rhonda and I have talked about today in how they communicate increases engagement while also creating more inclusive, equitable, and empowering learning environments. If today's episode sparked ideas or reflections, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at udl.in.action.podcast@gmail.com. And if you'd like the show notes or resources mentioned, just click on the link at the end of each episode description to our G Drive folder for listeners. And please share our podcast with your colleagues through YouTube or Spotify. Until next time, keep designing for possibility, not predictability. We'll see you later for now.
Toodaloo.
Bye.